Thank you, Andrea. Today's speaker is John Zeratsky. John grew up in Wisconsin. He's a UW-Madison grad where he also met his wife. He currently serves on the School of Human Ecology's Board of Visitors. For 15 years, John was a designer for a number of technology companies, including a few that you might recognize, like YouTube and Google. While with Google Ventures, he helped develop the design sprint process and worked with close to 200 startups. He co-authored the New York Times bestseller, Sprint, How to Solve Big Problems and Test New Ideas in Just 5 Days, authored a second book, Make Time, How to Focus on What Matters Every Day. And his writings have been published in the Wall Street Journal, Time, Harvard Business Review, Wired, Fast Company, and many others. In 2017, John and his wife left San Francisco for an open-ended sailing journey. After that journey, he's embarked on his next chapter as a self-employed writer in Milwaukee, and reflecting on it all, the process of making time, the journey itself, the lessons learned, and what's important. He is now going to share his story on how anyone can make time for what's important, for what matters to them. If you have questions after John's presentation, you can come up to the podium, and John agreed to stay a little bit after to answer your questions. So, welcome, John.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. This is a real honor to be here. Bear with me for a moment. I got to do some IT work up here. People are always asking me IT questions because I worked in the tech industry for so long. Well, thanks again. As Jason said, I spent about 15 years working in the technology industry as a designer. And these days, I'm focused on helping people make good use of their time. I've written a couple of books about this. First one about the 5-day design sprint process. The second one, which just came out last year, is about redesigning your days around the things that are most important to you. And that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about making time for what matters. And this is something that is increasingly difficult to do because many of us have calendars that look something like this. We've got phones that we carry around in our pockets or our handbags that are constantly trying to tell us something is very important and urgent. And sometimes when we feel a little bit busy and distracted and frazzled and maybe burned out from all of it, we look back on the day or the week and we ask ourselves, what happened? What did I really do? I know that I was busy, but what do I have to show for all my busyness all that time? If you've ever felt this way, and trust me, I've felt that way a million times, you might be tempted to think that it's really a matter of insufficient willpower. Or maybe it has to do with discipline, right? If you were just more disciplined and stronger, you could resist getting distracted and stay on task, stay focused on what you want to do. Maybe it's self-control, right? We've got so many temptations these days in terms of the information, the entertainment that's available to us. Maybe if you just were, had a bit better self-control. But I don't think this is right at all. In fact, there's more and more evidence that this idea of willpower itself might be a little bit of a myth. It seems that the more scientists study willpower in a psychological setting, the more they realize that it doesn't really exist in the way that we previously understood it. This has been reported on by the Harvard Business Review, Nautilus, a science magazine, and I recently discovered that the New York Times had a story about this 20 years ago. So in 1999, in this context, it was about dieting. But same kind of idea applies. What often looks to us like willpower, like somebody's very strong, is really a function of the environment that they live in, sort of the world that they have around them. And one of the forces that is so prevalent in our world, in our environment, that determines the decisions that we make about our time every day is something that sounds very innocent, but makes it all the more insidious. It's defaults. It's the default settings. And these defaults are everywhere, and they have a huge power over how we spend our time. For example, consider your smartphone. So when you get a smartphone, brand new one, you pull it out of the box, the very first thing that you do is you sign into your email provider. Okay? And by default, your phone has an email app pre-installed. By default, it checks for new messages automatically, and it shows you a notification when you have a new email. By default, our phones have web browsers pre-installed, which is sort of a Swiss Army knife to distraction. If you ever have a question, like the trivia question, you can just look it up on your phone. Or don't actually look the trivia question up, but you know what I mean. By default, our phones can show us notifications of just how far behind we are on our to-do list. And we've got all these enticing, exciting little bits of infinite content that are pre-installed on our phones. The news, streaming video, even stock market updates. It's all so tantalizing. It's right there, literally at our fingertips. But it's not just our technology. These defaults exist in our calendars and in our workplaces. By default, our meetings are sort of scattered throughout the week, leaving these little scraps of time during which we're expected to do our work, the stuff that we show up to the office to do. By default, in many organizations, other people can put stuff on our calendars. And by default, we say yes to meeting invitations, right? And so what started out as a tool often becomes kind of a brick wall that we bounce up against. And so maybe we decide that we're going to get smart, we're going to get clever, we're going to optimize this, we're going to start to color code our calendar so we can better keep track of what we're doing. But before long, it's like the calendar is all there is, right? And instead of this tool to help us make good use of our time, it's like a minefield that we need to navigate. We need to just, if we want to get across to the other side, it's all we can do. Like Frogger, crossing the road. It's an old school video game reference. So these are some of the defaults that make it so difficult for us to spend our time on the things that are important to us. But here's the crazy thing. These defaults, they're accidental. They're not sort of part of some master plan that somebody put in place to help us optimally spend our time every day. They're just the collection of things that stuck, decisions made by one company over there, and things that got baked into one office culture over here. But we accept them as inevitable. There is good news here, believe it or not. The first bit is that once you understand this idea of defaults, you start to see that if you feel busy, you feel distracted, and you feel like you don't have time, it's not your fault. It's not because you're not strong, you don't have willpower. It's because of the defaults of the world that we live in. And even better, you can actually create new defaults. These things are not set in stone. You can override them. You can put your own defaults in place. And when you do that, you can redesign your time around the things that are most important to you. So I'm going to talk in some detail about how you can do this. But before I get into that, I've got to give you a little bit of personal history. Got to take you back in time, back to the 1980s when I was just a kid growing up in Wisconsin. And I'm from a place called Green Lake, which is right here. And in Green Lake, we have a very deep lake and a very, very small town. Fewer than 1,000 people live in Green Lake. I had 36 kids in my high school class. Only 32 graduated. Growing up in Green Lake was very, very quiet. It's the kind of place that adults say is just great for kids, but the kids just think it's pretty boring. And on top of that, well, let's just say I wasn't one of the cool kids at school. I wasn't good at sports. I wasn't funny. I didn't have cool clothes or know all the pop culture references. I was a nerd. So like many other nerdy kids, I sought out projects. I sought out interesting things that I could apply myself to. And I got a lot of reinforcement and encouragement for those types of things. I would design artwork for CDs that didn't exist. I would create plans for boats that would never be built. I got really into music. I played saxophone in the jazz band, and I played the drums in the pep band at the basketball games. And this was my life. I sort of took that interest and that focus on creative work and projects with me into college. 2001, I started at UW-Madison, and I continued doing the same kind of stuff. While I was there, I designed a newspaper, 2 magazines. I got into web design. I was still into music. I played in bands. I got into writing and recording and producing music. And in 2005, after graduation, I was lucky enough to get a job at a tech startup in Chicago called FeedBurner. And you've probably never heard of FeedBurner, sort of lost to the dustbin of internet history at this point. But I was really excited for this job because the team that started FeedBurner, they were an experienced entrepreneurial team. They had started companies together before, they'd had some success, and here I was, just this nerdy kid from small town Wisconsin, just graduated from college, and I felt like, okay, like, here we go. This is my moment. This is the big time. This is my chance to prove myself. So I channeled my interest in creative, focused work into the pursuit of optimal productivity. I read this book called Getting Things Done, and it became my Bible. I had all kinds of crazy and ridiculous systems set up. I would carry a stack of note cards with me at all times so I could keep track of things as they popped into my brain. I had this filing system that had 43 different date-based folders. My to-do list was perfectly organized. Every day I would completely process my email inbox so that no message went unaccounted for. And this worked okay for me, or so I thought. I was doing good work. I was productive. I was getting things done. And in 2007, FeedBurner was actually acquired by Google. So I found myself as a user experience designer inside of Google, working on some of Google's big money-making advertising products. And I had more emails than ever, and I had more meetings to go to, and more process and bureaucracy and documents to complete. And so it really suited my interest in productivity, until it didn't. In 2008, during a dark and dreary Chicago winter, one day my wife and I had gone out with some friends. I think maybe we'd gone to watch a Packers game at the bar or something like that. And we came back, we got home, walked in the door, and the first thing I said to her was, I should have stayed home and worked. And as soon as the words left my mouth, I knew how bad it was. It wasn't just what I was saying about Michelle, my wife, or our friends, and how I valued them and I valued our relationships. It was what I was saying about myself. I'd become so intoxicated and poisoned by this idea of productivity that I had lost sight of what was really important. So I decided I needed to take a step back. I needed to change my perspective. And so I started looking at my days, how I was spending my days. What I used to do was get to the office as quickly as possible and very efficiently and productively work through all the stuff that I had to do till the day was done. I would go home. But I realized that some of the things that I did each day were more important than other things. So I decided that maybe I should focus on those a little bit more. I had learned by this point that I had my best creative energy in the morning. So I would work on whatever that important thing was first thing in the morning. I would make sure that I had time for a proper break, a real lunch instead of just kind of grabbing something at my desk and eating quickly. And that administrative work, the things that needed to happen, but really didn't require my sort of top focus, the meetings and the emails and all that kind of stuff, I would push to the end of the day as much as possible. And I became really interested in this idea that each day, there's really just a small number of things that actually matter. There's maybe one thing that you need to get done that day, maybe a couple things, maybe one thing in the office, one thing at home. And I began to think of this as my daily highlight, the part of my day where I wanted to bring my best energy. I took this new perspective with me as I moved out to San Francisco with my wife, and I started a new job, still inside of Google, but on a team called Google Ventures, now just known as GV. At Google Ventures, we were investing in startups that were outside of Google, so they were unrelated to Google. And I had a really cool job. I would go into those companies after the investment was made and work with them as sort of a consultant. I would get to bring my background as a designer and a writer and help them work toward whatever goals they had as a business. And these companies that we worked with, they were amazing. They had great teams of people who were super experienced and knew what they were doing. They were working on really exciting, big problems and opportunities. But when I looked at how they actually worked day to day, they had the same fragmented calendars, the same overflowing to-do lists, the same email inboxes that I had struggled with myself. This didn't seem right. This seemed like really a missed opportunity for all these companies who had risked everything, put everything on the line to pursue something new and something exciting. Around this time, I met this guy named Jake Knapp. Jake Knapp was a designer at Google, and he had begun to experiment with this team process, this new way of working that he called a design sprint. The idea with the design sprint was to take 1 week of a team's time to clear away the default calendar, kind of the fragmented meetings and little scraps of time, and replace it with one important step each day, one important thing that needed to get done. And these became, for those teams, for that week, this became their new set of defaults. So instead of trying to worry about everything at once, in a sprint, we could focus on one thing at a time. Instead of relying on email and chat to sort of slowly move things forward bit by bit over weeks or months, in a sprint, we work together face to face. Instead of fragmented days where we're searching and scrapping for little bits of time where we can do the work that really matters, in a sprint, we have time to focus. And Jake and I began to run these sprints together. And we use them to design all kinds of products and marketing and services. But really what we were doing was we were designing time. See, Jake was also really interested in the question of what the best way to spend his time was. And we saw this as a really unique opportunity to use all these companies in the Google Ventures portfolio as our laboratory, right? We could go into a company, we could say, hey, let's try this thing for a week. What if we set aside the normal ways of working? We questioned those defaults, and we tried something new. So we got to test. Jake came to our team at Google Ventures, and we began to run these sprints. And we ran them with about 150 different startups in the Google Ventures portfolio over a number of years. And eventually we had the process down to something that was kind of a repeatable recipe, something reliable. We knew that if we took it into a company, it would work. They would kind of stop wasting time, wondering if they were doing the right thing, and they would really focus on the core of whatever initiative that was. So in 2016, we published this book, Sprint, about the process, and after it came out, we watched the process spread far beyond the Google Ventures portfolio to all sorts of different companies. First, big tech companies, but then all kinds of agencies and consultancies and large corporations and even into the public sector. And this was really, really exciting. Jake and I, at times we still have to pinch ourselves. We can't believe how many people have taken this process and used it as a way of rethinking the defaults of what they do at work. It was a way for these teams to redesign their work week. But it required a whole team and a whole week. It was kind of a big commitment because the team had to get everybody together and say, we're going to do a design sprint. It wasn't something that kind of happened day in and day out. But Jake and I started to wonder, what if we could redesign every day? What if we could use these same philosophies, these same principles to make time for the things that we wanted to do every day, to reset those defaults of day-to-day life? So being the nerds that we are, we started to run all sorts of dorky experiments with time on ourselves. We searched for ways of building better focus and decreasing distraction and having better energy so that we could focus on the things that we really wanted to do. And after a couple of years of experimenting with these things, we felt like it was working. We were doing good work, we were getting promoted, we were making good money, we were having fun at work, but we also kind of felt less stressed, we felt less busy. We were doing more important things than ever, but it felt like time was going more slowly in a really good way. But still, these tactics, these approaches were only working for us, the two of us. And we didn't know if they were going to apply to other people in other situations. So we decided to start this newsletter that we called Time Dorks, and we began to write articles, blog posts, about the experiments we were doing and put those out on the web, ask people to try them and to write back to us and let us know how they worked for them, and people did. And some people just wanted to tell us that we were idiots and we should stop what we were doing. But a lot of people really got a lot out of these ideas. A lot of people told us that it allowed them to spend their time on the things that they wanted to be doing, not just reacting all day, not just kind of operating on autopilot day in and day out. We combined all these tactics, these experiments that we had run, these big ideas, into something that we call Make Time, which is kind of a daily framework that helps busy, distracted people rethink those defaults and make time for the things that are important to them. It's based on what we learned from running those design sprints, our own personal experiences, as well as the stories that we were getting back from our readers. We turned this into a book, which came out in 2018, and the book has 87 different concrete tactics, so these bite-sized little things that you can try. And the idea is not to do all of them, but they're all based around kind of this core philosophy of being intentional with your time. And we boiled it down to 4 steps, so 4 daily steps. The first is highlight. And it's all about asking yourself the question, what do I want to be the highlight of my day? It might be something at home, it might be something at work, it might be something that's time sensitive or something that you've just been meaning to get around to. And it's certainly not the only thing you'll do that day, that would be crazy, but it's the thing that requires and demands your top energy, your top focus. It sounds kind of silly, but even just kind of slowing down for a second and thinking and asking yourself this question, and then even if you just write it on a sticky note, there's something magical that happens in your brain, and you're like, yeah, that's my highlight. Like, that's the thing that I've got to make time for today. And it leads to all sorts of other good decisions throughout the day. The second step is laser. And laser is all about creating barriers to distraction. Every single thing that you find distracting, it was engineered to be that way. It was designed to be as smooth, as compelling, as friction-free, as enticing as possible. And that's true whether it's Instagram or Angry Birds or the newspaper. These things are all very intentionally crafted. And I believe that the best way to avoid distraction is to kind of remove the temptation in the first place, to put some of that friction back in, to make it more difficult to do that quick check of the phone, for example. I've talked a lot about phones so far, and you won't be surprised to hear that smartphones are kind of at the epicenter of this distraction epidemic. It's not just the things that our phones do by default, it's all the apps that we install on our phones. And it's the fact that each one of these apps has the ability to interrupt us and tell us things by default, and notifications can pop in. And any one of these apps on its own might be really good and really useful, but when they're all working together, it can become really quite overwhelming. You can start to feel like our phones are using us instead of the other way around. So whether you identify one of these apps that you find so distracting and you remove it entirely from your phone, or maybe you log out of a website that you often find yourself wasting time on, or even something simple like delaying your first check of email until a couple hours later in the day. Anything you can do to put a barrier, a speed bump between you and getting sucked into those vortexes, those black holes of distraction, will have a big impact on your ability to control your time throughout the day. The third step is energize. And it's all about building energy so that you can enjoy and focus on the moments that matter to you. When we're feeling frazzled, we're feeling worn out, we're feeling like we've been pulled in a million different directions, it's hard to be present. When we do have time for something that's important to us, oftentimes we're not really there. And so in the book, we give a bunch of very simple suggestions. These are not mind-blowing things. They're things you've probably heard before, but suggestions about improving the quality of your sleep and moving your body more to stay energized, spending time with other people, which can provide an energy boost. Simple things like that that help you bring energy into every part of your day. And finally, the fourth step is called reflect. It's based upon the insight that the best way to make a change in your life is to take it one day at a time. Not to worry about some grand transformation that you're going to do, someday in the future, maybe when things are different, but looking at the one thing that you can do today and tomorrow and the day after that to actually spend your time differently. It's extremely helpful when you take this daily approach if you keep track, if you keep notes in some way of what's working well for you. And so in our book, Make Time, we suggest this kind of simple notes sheet where you can just sort of write down What was your highlight? Did you actually have time for it? How did you feel during the day? And what are you going to do differently tomorrow? What are you going to try? So that's reflect, and those are the 4 steps of make time. The book describes each of those steps in detail, and it also provides this menu of 87 different specific concrete tactics that you can use to make it work in your day-to-day life. So that's a bit about make time and a bit about my background, but I left out an important chapter of my story, and this isn't usually a part of my presentations. In fact, this is the very first time that I am sharing this part of my story in a presentation in a spoken way. So hopefully you'll enjoy it. These defaults I started talking about, they exist in our lifestyles as well. Over time, good or bad, there are certain practices and habits, behaviors that just sort of pile up. They just sort of collect. You started doing each of them for a reason, but maybe you get to a point where you don't love everything about your life. You don't love everything about what you're doing every day. And it's natural, I think, to question, could you change those things? How might life be different if you reset some of those defaults? But just like the defaults on your phone, your calendar, these too can be changed. In 2017, my wife, Michelle, and I, we decided to reset the defaults of our life in San Francisco. We had lived there about 8 years, and we had a life that was busy, full, and very good. It was a great life. We both had really good jobs, working full-time, kind of corporate office setting. We had full schedules. We had friends. We were always busy. And because we were busy, we took advantage of the many conveniences that exist when you're living in an urban environment. We would order dinner delivered on our phone. We would, use Amazon one-day shipping to get stuff right away when we needed it. Sometimes we would take 3 or 4 Ubers in the course of a day just to kind of get around and navigate the city. And it was all good, but we had talked for a long time about slowing things down, about whether it would be possible for us to more intentionally build a life around the things that we wanted to be spending our time on, the things that were really important to us. But we didn't know quite what that would look like. It wasn't like we had this perfect vision in our heads that we could just, create. So we decided to step away from normal life in San Francisco and give ourselves a chance to figure it out. So in 2017, we moved aboard our sailboat, Pineapple. We quit our jobs, we moved out of our apartment, we got rid of most of our stuff, and we sailed out the Golden Gate, out into the Pacific. We headed down the coast through California, Mexico. We ended up spending about 4 months in Mexico, where we got our first taste of tropical beaches with palm trees. We visited really cool seaside towns and hiked inland to some amazing waterfalls. We continued on, stopping in El Salvador, Nicaragua, and then into Costa Rica, where we spent about 6 weeks. We met monkeys. We enjoyed the abundant wildlife, including dolphins that would come to swim by the boat every time we were sailing. We went into the very, very remote rural part of western Panama, where we were often the only boat anchored in a bay. We had beaches all to ourselves. We took our boat through the Panama Canal, popped out on the other side in the Caribbean, and spent some time on that side of Panama, in the San Blas Islands, and in Bocas del Toro, which is kind of a jungly, lush part of Panama. And then we sailed north across the Caribbean Sea to the Cayman Islands. We spent about 4 days on that passage, 4 days at sea, day and night sailing. And then we stayed for a week, and then we did it again, sailing up and around Cuba, finishing up in Key West. And for the very first time, our boat Pineapple was back in the United States. Sometime in late 2018, we had begun to feel like we had experienced the reset that we were looking for. We were feeling re-energized. We were feeling ready to move on to the next chapter of our life. So we decided to move to Milwaukee. It's a place where we felt like we could really design a life around the work and the projects and the people that were important to us. We had friends and family there, already, which made it, in some ways, an easy choice. But we also appreciated the slower and easier pace of life, especially compared to what we knew in San Francisco. We are now settled there. We've been in Milwaukee officially full-time since early May, although we did spend hurricane season there last summer as well. And going through all this change, this big transition of resetting what we considered to be normal about our lives has made me aware of a couple important lessons. The first one is about the difference between taking care of oneself and contributing to something that is bigger than us. When we were on the boat, we had complete responsibility for ourselves. We made our own drinking water using a desalinator machine. We were constantly vigilant to make sure that we were safe and that the boat was safe. Little normal chores like getting groceries would sometimes take half a day, as we're navigating an unfamiliar environment in a language that we didn't know. And that stuff was very rewarding. It was very cool. It was so different from what we had known living in San Francisco. But I learned that it doesn't compare to the feeling of contributing to causes, to companies, organizations, teams, whatever it is, things that are bigger than us, things that are outside of ourselves. And we feel like living in Wisconsin, living in Milwaukee allows us to do that. The second important lesson that I learned was really relearning the value of belonging. When we lived on the boat, we weren't totally disconnected, although it might seem like we were. Really, in reality, we weren't. I mean, of course, we were connected to each other, and we were still connected to our friends and our family. We were in touch with them. It's not like we, disappeared totally off the grid or anything like that. We also enjoyed becoming friends with other people that we met who were traveling. Maybe they were on their own boat or they were backpacking or whatever. But I learned that these threads of connection, no matter how strong, they can't replace the fabric of belonging, that feeling that you really belong to a place, that you have this deep connection not just to a place but to the people, and that you're really supposed to be there. That's where you belong. I started to kind of look around and notice what were some of the factors that created this sort of alchemy of belonging. What were the things that needed to exist in order for us to feel like we belonged? And I noticed a few things just in our first couple months in Milwaukee. I noticed that, of course, you need strong social ties. You have to know people to feel like you belong somewhere. But it really helps when you have shared values because they provide sort of a shortcut or an on-ramp to connection. You don't have to start from totally zero, blank canvas. You have something shared already. I believe that ritual and routine are really important to feeling like you belong because they put people in contact with one another, right? You don't have to plan always to get together with people. You know that you're just going to run into them sort of in the normal course of your day. And finally, the fourth element that I noticed was traditions, things that people do together that tie them to sort of the movement of seasons, the movement of time. And so those are the kind of four elements of belonging that I noticed living in Milwaukee and transitioning from all the change that we've been through. With this sort of new perspective and with everything I've learned, I'm now 100% focused on helping people make time for what matters, whether it's at home, it's at work, it's in projects or hobbies or whatever they want to be doing, new initiatives at work, anything that's important to people, I want to help them make time for it. And so, whether there are things that I mentioned today, specific things that you want to try, or you go and you read some of the stuff that I've written or whatever, I hope that my work can help you rethink the defaults of how you spend your time and find ways to focus on what's most important to you. Thank you very much. While we don't have time for audience questions, I would love to hear from any and all of you. This is my contact info. Please look me up. And finally, just one small sales pitch. I set up a special web page for you all. It's if you go to maketime.blog/Rotary, there's like a little gift for you. So if you go there, you can sign up and you can claim it. Thanks again.
Thank you, John, for that great presentation. And thank you to Phil Levy for recommending John as a speaker today. We really appreciate that. John, as he said, will be here for a few minutes if you have a question. Also encourage you, if you want to bid on those Brewers tickets, Jason's here. And we are adjourned.